They thought he was just homeless. Until they learned the truth. Get that homeless man out of here before the donors arrive. The words cut across the marble lobby of St. Catherine Medical Center like a blade. Every head turned. Near the revolving doors stood a tall black man in a faded army green coat. Rainwater dripped from the hem onto the polished floor. His beard was streaked with gray. One boot was held together with silver tape, and everything he appeared to own was packed inside an old canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. 2 security guards were already walking toward him. But the man wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for food. He wasn't even asking for shelter. He was staring at a framed photograph on the lobby wall. A photograph of the hospital's 12-story pediatric wing. And beneath it, a polished brass plaque bearing the name of the man who had supposedly paid for it. "The Richard Halston Children's Center, sir," one guard said. "You need to leave." The homeless man slowly looked away from the photograph. His eyes settled on Richard Halston himself, the billionaire developer standing 20 feet away in a charcoal suit, surrounded by board members, reporters, and donors. For one strange second, something changed in the homeless man's face. Not anger, recognition. Then he quietly said, "That building shouldn't have his name on it." The lobby went silent. Richard's smile disappeared. "What did you say?" The man looked directly at him. "I said that building shouldn't have your name on it." A few donors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard gave a short laugh. "Do I know you?" The stranger's fingers tightened around the strap of his canvas bag. "No." Then his eyes moved toward the children's wing. "But you knew my wife." 3 days later, Richard Halston would stand in that same lobby while workers removed his name from the wall. And the homeless man everyone had thrown into the rain would be holding evidence capable of exposing a lie buried for 20 years. But that morning, no one knew any of that. They only saw his coat, his broken boot, his skin, and the rainwater beneath his feet. His name was Elijah Carter. He was 58 years old, although grief had added years to his face. For 7 months, he had slept wherever the city allowed him to disappear. Sometimes beneath the old railway bridge on Fulton Street. Sometimes inside the overnight shelter near St. Mark's Church. And when every bed was taken, Elijah slept behind a laundromat where warm air escaped through a metal vent and made winter slightly less cruel. He had learned the geography of survival. Which restaurants threw away untouched bread after closing. Which public bathrooms stayed unlocked after midnight. Which police officers woke homeless men with a voice and which ones used their boots. Which churches asked questions before offering soup. And which ones simply opened the door. But Elijah hadn't always lived that way. There had been a house once. Small, blue shutters, a maple tree in the front yard, and a woman named Grace who sang badly while cooking and laughed whenever Elijah told her so. Grace Carter had been a pediatric nurse, not the kind whose name appeared in newspapers. She worked night shifts, held frightened children when their parents couldn't, bought birthday cupcakes with her own money, and kept a drawer filled with stickers because she believed no child should leave a hospital without receiving something that belonged only to them. Elijah had loved her for 31 years. Cancer took her in 11 months. The medical bills took almost everything else. Then came the depression, then missed work, then the eviction notice. By the time Elijah understood how far he had fallen, the blue house belonged to someone else. His tools had been sold, and all that remained of Grace fit inside the canvas bag he carried on his shoulder. Still, every morning he shaved as carefully as he could in the restroom of the central bus station. He folded his blanket. He cleaned the place where he had slept. And whenever he had 2 sandwiches, he ate one. That Tuesday morning, the second sandwich went to a young homeless veteran named Luis. "You need it more than me," Elijah said. Luis stared at him. "You haven't eaten since yesterday." Elijah pushed the sandwich into his hands. "Then eat slowly so I can watch." Luis laughed. That was Elijah. The world had taken his home, his job, his savings, his wife. It had not yet taken his ability to be kind. Around noon, Elijah walked toward St. Catherine Medical Center. He hadn't planned to go inside. He only wanted warmth. Rain had soaked through his coat, and his left knee, the one damaged years earlier in a construction accident, was beginning to ache. Then he saw a little girl standing beneath the hospital awning. She was maybe 8. Pink jacket, purple backpack. No adult beside her. She was crying. People passed without stopping. Elijah did. "You lost somebody?" The girl looked at his clothes first, then his face. "My mom." What's her name? Jennifer. Okay. Elijah remained several feet away so he wouldn't frighten her. I'm Elijah. We won't go anywhere. We'll stand right here where she can find you. The girl's breathing slowed. Elijah noticed a hospital bracelet around her wrist. Were you a patient? She nodded. Heart surgery. Elijah smiled gently. My wife used to take care of brave kids like you. Was she a doctor? Better. The girl frowned. What was she? A nurse. That earned the smallest smile. 2 minutes later, a terrified woman came running through the doors. Emily. The girl rushed into her arms. The mother squeezed her tightly, then looked at Elijah. Her relief changed. Only slightly. But Elijah saw it. Her arm tightened around her daughter. Her eyes dropped to his coat. Then his bag. Did he bother you? Emily looked confused. No. He helped me. The mother hesitated. Thank you. Elijah nodded. You're welcome. Nothing more. He turned toward the hospital entrance. Behind him, Emily called out. Bye, Mr. Elijah. He raised one hand without looking back. Inside, St. Catherine was preparing for its annual Founders Gala. White orchids lined the lobby. Workers polished brass railings. A string quartet rehearsed beside the grand staircase. At the center of everything stood Richard Halston, 61, real estate billionaire, hospital board chairman. His photograph appeared in business magazines beside words like visionary, philanthropist, builder. Richard had donated millions to St. Catherine. Or at least, that was what everyone believed. The pediatric wing bearing his name had made him a local legend. That afternoon, reporters were coming to celebrate the 20th anniversary of its opening. Richard inspected the lobby like a general before battle. Then he saw Elijah. The wet coat offended the symmetry of the room. Richard leaned toward hospital administrator Charles Whitmore. Why is there a homeless man in the lobby? Charles glanced over. I'll handle it. Elijah barely noticed them. He had stopped beside a display containing photographs from the hospital's history. One image showed the groundbreaking ceremony for the pediatric wing 20 years earlier. Politicians, doctors, donors. Richard Halston, much younger, holding a ceremonial shovel. Elijah moved closer. Behind Richard stood a row of nurses. And there she was, Grace. Her smile was half hidden behind another woman's shoulder. Elijah's breath caught. 20 years disappeared. He could almost smell her lavender soap. Almost hear her keys hitting the kitchen counter after a night shift. Almost hear her complaining about administrators who cared more about polished floors than frightened children. He lifted his hand toward the glass, but stopped before touching it. Sir. A security guard approached. You can't stay here. Elijah nodded. I understand. But then he noticed the plaque. Richard's name, the date, and one sentence. Made possible through the extraordinary generosity of Richard Halston. Elijah stared. Something old moved behind his eyes. No, he whispered. Richard heard him. That was when the words were spoken. That was when Elijah said the building shouldn't carry Richard's name. And that was when the room turned against him. Richard walked closer. You knew my wife? Elijah said. Richard's expression remained cold. I've known thousands of hospital employees. Grace Carter. Nothing. Then, a flicker. So small most people missed it. Elijah didn't. Richard straightened. Security. One guard touched Elijah's arm. Elijah pulled away, not violently, just enough to reclaim his dignity. Don't touch me. I'll walk. Richard stepped closer. You come into a hospital during a private event, make accusations, and expect people to tolerate it. I made no accusation. You said my name doesn't belong on that building. It doesn't. Richard's jaw tightened. Based on what? Elijah looked around. Reporters were beginning to notice. Phones lifted. Charles Whitmore whispered something to security. Elijah could have shouted. He could have humiliated Richard in front of everyone. Instead, he lowered his voice. Ask him where the first money came from. Richard's face changed. Elijah saw it. Fear. Then it vanished behind anger. Remove him. The guards escorted Elijah toward the doors. Someone laughed quietly. Another donor muttered. Probably drunk. Elijah heard that too. He kept walking. His shoulders remained straight. At the revolving door, a hospital employee accidentally dropped a box of programs. Hundreds of glossy sheets scattered across the floor. Elijah stopped. The security guard sighed. Keep moving. Elijah bent down. He gathered the programs. Every one of them carried Richard Halston's smiling face. He placed them carefully back inside the box. Then he walked into the rain. That evening, Elijah returned to the railway bridge. His clothes were still damp. Traffic thundered overhead. He sat beside a concrete pillar and opened his canvas bag. Inside were 3 shirts, a photograph of Grace, a military medal that had belonged to his father, a Bible with a cracked spine, and a small metal cash box. Elijah had not opened it in almost a year. His fingers rested on the latch. Grace had given him the box 2 weeks before she died. "Only open it if you ever need to remember who you are," she'd said. At the time, Elijah thought she meant photographs, memories, love letters. He hadn't understood. Now he opened it. Inside lay several envelopes, a stack of photocopied bank records, newspaper clippings, and a small black notebook. On top was an envelope addressed to him. Elijah. He unfolded the letter. Grace's handwriting trembled across the page. She wrote about the pediatric wing, about a donor named Samuel Bell, a reclusive shipping entrepreneur whose 6-year-old daughter had died at St. Catherine decades earlier. Bell had quietly pledged $32 million to build a children's center. He wanted no publicity, only one condition. The wing would remain focused on families who couldn't afford treatment. Grace had been one of 3 hospital employees asked to help coordinate the original charitable fund. Then Samuel Bell died unexpectedly. Months later, Richard Halston appeared publicly as the project's great benefactor. The Bell Foundation disappeared from the story. Grace had noticed transfers, altered meeting minutes, documents reissued under different names. She had confronted hospital executives. They told her she misunderstood. Then they told her to stop asking questions. Grace didn't stop. She copied everything. Elijah stared at the papers beneath the bridge while rain ticked softly against the concrete. One document carried Richard Halston's signature. Another carried Charles Whitmore's. And then Elijah found something that made his hands go cold. A memorandum. The original charitable agreement. Samuel Bell had required that at least 40% of the pediatric wing's annual capacity be reserved for uninsured or low-income children. Elijah thought about Grace. He remembered the last years of her career. Her frustration. The families she said were being turned away. He remembered one sentence she had repeated at the dinner table. They built that place for children who had nowhere else to go. Now they're turning it into a monument for people who already have everything. Elijah had listened, but he hadn't understood. Not fully. Until now. The next morning, he returned to St. Catherine. Security stopped him outside. "You're banned from the property. I need to speak to someone from the board." "No, I have documents." The guard glanced at the canvas bag. "I'm sure you do." Elijah felt the insult, but he did not return it. He simply nodded. "All right." He turned away. Then he heard crying. A woman sat on a bench near the parking garage holding a little boy against her chest. A hospital employee stood over them. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Without the deposit, admissions can't authorize the procedure. My insurance appeal is still pending." "I understand." "He can't wait 3 weeks." The employee looked miserable. No." The woman covered her face. Elijah stopped. The boy looked 6, maybe 7. His skin had the pale gray tone Elijah remembered from hospital waiting rooms with Grace. He walked toward them. The employee stiffened. "Sir, you need to keep moving." Elijah looked at the woman. "What does he need?" "Please," she whispered. "I can't do this right now." Elijah nodded. "I'm sorry." He walked away, but the scene followed him. That afternoon, Elijah took the city bus across town. He found the address printed at the bottom of Grace's old documents. Bell and Mercer Legal Trust. The building had moved. The firm had changed names. But one attorney remained. Eleanor Mercer, 80 years old, silver hair, sharp eyes. She looked at Elijah across her desk for almost a full minute after he said Grace's name. "Where have you been?" Elijah frowned. "You knew my wife?" Eleanor stood. She walked around the desk slowly. "Mr. Carter, we've been trying to find you for 11 months. Elijah's heart began pounding. "Why?" Eleanor looked at his coat, his worn shoes, the canvas bag. Then she seemed to understand something that made her eyes soften. "Please sit down." Elijah remained standing. "Why were you looking for me?" Eleanor opened a file. "Because Grace Carter was the last surviving independent trustee named in Samuel Bell's original charitable agreement." Elijah stared at her. "And after her death," Eleanor continued, "her trustee authority passed to the beneficiary she designated." Elijah said nothing. Eleanor turned the document around. His name was there. Elijah James Carter. He almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the absurdity hurt. He had spent 7 months sleeping beneath bridges while his name sat inside a legal document connected to millions of dollars. "I'm not rich," he said. "No, then what does this mean?" "It means you don't own the money." Eleanor leaned forward. "You have something more inconvenient." "What?" "The legal authority to demand an independent audit of how that money has been used." Silence. Elijah looked down at Grace's signature. His eyes burned. She hadn't left him wealth. She had left him responsibility. Eleanor watched him carefully. "You could negotiate privately," she said. "Given what these records suggest, certain people may pay a great deal to keep this quiet." Elijah looked up. "How much?" "Potentially enough that you'd never worry about money again." For one moment, Elijah imagined it. A house, a warm bed, new shoes, a refrigerator with food inside. No more bridges. No more guards looking at him as if poverty were contagious. Then he remembered the little boy outside the parking garage. How many children have been turned away? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. "We don't know." "Then we're not keeping it quiet." By noon the next day, Richard Halston was in the hospital boardroom when Eleanor Mercer entered carrying a leather briefcase. Elijah walked behind her. Conversation stopped. Richard stood. "You." Elijah said nothing. Charles Whitmore turned pale. Eleanor placed a folder on the table. "Mr. Halston, my client is requesting an immediate forensic audit of the Bell Pediatric Trust." Richard's face hardened. "There is no Bell Pediatric Trust." Eleanor opened the folder. "There is now." She began laying documents across the table. Original agreements, bank transfers, board minutes, letters, signatures. 20 years of buried history returned one page at a time. Richard didn't sit. Charles did. His knees seemed to fail him. One board member picked up the original agreement. 32 million? Another stared at Richard. "You told us the initial capital was yours." Richard's voice sharpened. "I raised additional money. I saved that project. By removing Bell's name? That was a branding decision." Eleanor looked at him. "You mean after the donor died and could no longer object?" Richard's face flushed. Then Elijah finally spoke. "My wife objected." Richard looked at him. "She came to you?" No answer. "She showed you these documents?" Richard's eyes shifted. That was answer enough. Elijah's voice remained quiet. "What did you tell her?" Richard's shoulders slowly dropped. "She didn't understand the financial structure." Elijah stared at him. "She understood children." No one moved. "She understood what Mr. Bell wanted. She understood that poor families were supposed to have beds in that building." Elijah thought of the mother outside the parking garage. "Yesterday, I watched your hospital turn away a sick boy because his mother couldn't make a deposit." Charles Whitmore looked down. Elijah's hand rested on Grace's notebook. "You didn't just put the wrong man's name on a wall." His voice cracked for the first time. "You changed who the doors opened for." Richard looked as though someone had struck him. But Charles suddenly stood. "This is absurd. These documents are decades old. Half the people involved are dead. And we're allowing a homeless man to dictate hospital policy." The words hung there. "Homeless man." Elijah looked at him. Charles pointed toward the door. "You have no idea how an institution like this works." Elijah's face remained calm. "No." He glanced through the glass wall toward the children's wing. "But I know how a door works." Charles frowned. "It either opens." Elijah paused. "Or it doesn't." Nobody laughed. Eleanor slid another document across the table. "This is Mr. Carter's authorization as successor trustee." Charles stopped speaking. For the first time, the room didn't see Elijah's coat. They saw his name, his authority, his evidence. And somehow that made Elijah sadder than the insults had. Because he was the same man who had entered the lobby 2 days earlier. The only thing that had changed was what powerful people now knew he possessed. The audit took 48 hours to confirm what Grace had discovered 20 years earlier. Richard had indeed contributed millions later. But the foundation of the Children's Center had come from Samuel Bell. Records had been altered. Restrictions on charity care had gradually been weakened. Money intended for low-income pediatric patients had been redirected toward executive expansion, private suites, marketing, and donor programs. The story exploded. Reporters surrounded St. Catherine. Board members resigned. Charles Whitmore was suspended pending investigation. Richard Halston stepped down as chairman. But the photograph that traveled farthest wasn't of Richard. It was Elijah. Someone had captured him leaving the legal office. Same coat. Same broken boot. Same canvas bag. The headline read, Homeless man holds key to $32 million hospital scandal. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know Elijah Carter. Reporters who would have walked past him 3 days earlier now shouted his name. Television producers offered interviews. A hotel offered him a suite. A clothing company offered him a new wardrobe. One reporter asked him how it felt to finally be important. Elijah stopped walking. Finally, the reporter lowered her microphone. Elijah looked at her. I was important when I was sleeping under the bridge. Then he continued walking. He refused almost everything. He accepted one thing, a shower. Then he asked Eleanor if she could locate the mother and little boy who had been turned away. She did. His name was Noah Bennett. His surgery was scheduled for Friday, paid for by the charitable fund that should have covered him from the beginning. That evening, Elijah sat alone in Eleanor's office. City lights glowed against the windows. Grace's photograph rested on the desk. He touched the edge with one finger. You stubborn woman, he whispered. For the first time in months, he cried. Not loudly. His shoulders simply folded. Years of grief came out without permission. He cried for Grace. For the house with blue shutters. For the nights beneath the bridge. For the children Grace had tried to protect. And perhaps most of all, he cried because the woman he loved had trusted him with something important at a time when he had stopped believing he was important at all. Eleanor quietly left the room and closed the door. If this moment touched your heart, remember Elijah before the headlines, when he had nothing to offer the world but half a sandwich, a few gentle words, and the decision to remain kind when nobody was watching. Because character is often clearest when there is no audience to applaud it. The next morning, Richard Halston came looking for him. No entourage, no driver waiting at the curb, no tailored certainty. Just Richard. He found Elijah outside St. Mark's Church helping Louise repair the wheel on an old shopping cart. Richard stopped several feet away. Elijah. Elijah looked up. Louise glanced between them. You know this guy? Yes. Friend. Elijah wiped grease from his fingers. Not yet. Richard absorbed the words. I owe you an apology. Elijah returned to the wheel. You owe a lot of people apologies. I know. No. You know now. Richard looked away. Traffic hissed over wet pavement. I told myself I deserved the recognition, he said. I brought in more donors. I expanded the project. I convinced myself Belle's money was just the beginning. Elijah said nothing. And when Grace confronted me, Richard stopped. His voice became smaller. I threatened her job. Elijah's hands froze. There it was. The thing he hadn't known. Richard continued. She wouldn't back down. She told me a hospital wasn't a cathedral for wealthy men to carve their names into. Elijah almost smiled. That sounded like Grace. She said if I wanted my name remembered, I should put it somewhere children didn't have to suffer to see it. Richard's eyes were wet now. I hated her for saying it. Elijah stood. For several seconds, the two men faced each other on the sidewalk. One had billions. The other carried everything he owned on his shoulder. Yet Richard was the one who seemed small. You could destroy me, Richard said. Elijah shook his head. No, Richard looked surprised. The truth might destroy what you built. That's different. Is there a difference? There has to be. Elijah glanced toward the church. Otherwise, truth becomes revenge. Richard swallowed. What do you want? It was the question everyone had begun asking. What did Elijah want? Money? A house? A settlement? Richard's public humiliation? Elijah looked toward the hospital several blocks away. I want the original agreement restored. Richard nodded. Done. 40% minimum charity capacity. Done. Samuel Bell's name goes back on the building. Richard hesitated, then nodded. And Grace. Elijah's voice softened. A nursing scholarship. Not named after me. Named after her. Richard looked at him. Anything else? Elijah glanced at Louise, who was pretending not to listen. He looked at the line forming outside the church. Men in worn jackets. A woman pushing a stroller. An elderly veteran warming his hands around a paper cup. Yes. Richard waited. Stop treating poverty like a character defect. Richard had no answer. Elijah bent down and returned to fixing the wheel. 2 weeks later, St. Catherine held no gala. No champagne. No string quartet. Workers simply arrived one cold morning with ladders and tools. They removed the brass letters from the pediatric building. Richard Halston Children's Center one by one. The letters came down. Richard watched from across the street. So did Elijah. No reporters had been invited, although a few eventually appeared. When the workers finished, The new name caught the pale morning sunlight. The Samuel Bell Children's Center. Beneath it was a smaller plaque, dedicated to every child whose life is worth more than their ability to pay. Inside the lobby, another plaque had been installed. It was smaller still. No gold. No marble. Just brushed steel. The Grace Carter Nursing Scholarship. Elijah stood in front of it for a long time. A nurse approached him. "Mr. Carter?" He turned. Beside her stood Noah Bennett, the boy from the parking garage. He wore a blue sweater and had a fresh surgical dressing beneath his collar. His mother stood behind him, crying. Noah held out a folded piece of paper. Elijah opened it. It was a child's drawing. A tall building. A bright yellow sun. 3 stick figures holding hands. At the bottom, written in uneven letters, "Thank you for seeing me." Elijah's throat tightened. He crouched until they were eye level. "You know something?" Noah nodded seriously. "You're going to have to get stronger." "Why?" "Because one day somebody else is going to need you to see them." The boy considered this, then nodded. "Okay." He hugged Elijah. Across the lobby, Richard watched. He didn't interrupt. Months passed. Investigations continued. Money was recovered. New oversight rules were established. Charles Whitmore was charged after investigators found evidence that he had knowingly falsified records and authorized improper transfers. Richard was not spared public consequences either. He lost his chairmanship. Several organizations removed him from their boards. For weeks, his name appeared beneath ugly headlines. But he did something Elijah hadn't expected. He didn't fight to put the old lie back together. He sold several properties and returned funds investigators determined had been improperly attributed to his philanthropy. He began meeting families whose children had once been denied charity care. No cameras. No speeches. The first time Elijah heard about it, he shrugged. "Good." Louise stared at him. "That's it. What do you want me to do?" "Forgive him." Elijah shook his head. "Forgiveness isn't pretending it didn't happen." "So you don't forgive him?" Elijah considered that, then looked toward the street. "I think forgiveness is leaving the door unlocked." "For what?" "For somebody to become better." Louise smiled. "You always talk like that. Only when you're annoying me." They laughed. Some people called Richard's actions redemption. Elijah didn't. Redemption wasn't a press release. It wasn't a check. It wasn't one apology. It was what a person did tomorrow. And the day after that, when nobody was clapping anymore. Elijah eventually accepted an apartment through a veterans housing program. It was small. 1 bedroom. 2nd floor. The radiator knocked at night. The kitchen window faced a brick wall. He loved it. On his first evening there, he placed Grace's photograph beside the window. Then came the Bible, his father's medal, the metal cash box. Finally, the canvas bag. Elijah stood over it. For 7 months, packing that bag had been part of survival. Every possession had to be ready to move. Never spread out. Never get comfortable. Never believe a place was yours. He removed the shirts, Grace's notebook, the old letters. Then he folded the bag and placed it on the highest shelf of the closet. For the first time in 7 months, he didn't repack it. He turned off the kitchen light. Rain whispered against the window. Elijah climbed into bed. At 2 in the morning, he woke suddenly. For one confused second, he reached for the canvas bag. Then his hand touched a bedsheet. Warm. Clean. Still there. Elijah stared into the darkness. He understood. He was home. His eyes closed again. Winter softened into spring. One afternoon, Elijah returned to St. Catherine. Not for a board meeting. Not for reporters. He was carrying a cardboard box. Inside were children's books donated by the church. At the entrance, a new security guard held the door open. "Afternoon, Mr. Carter." Elijah stopped. The guard looked nervous, as though wondering whether he had said something wrong. Elijah smiled. "Afternoon." He walked inside. Sunlight poured through the glass ceiling and spread across the marble floor. Children moved through the lobby with parents and nurses. Some frightened, some laughing, some bawled from treatment, some in wheelchairs, some running when they had clearly been told not to. Life. Messy, loud, ordinary life. Near the old historical display, Elijah stopped. The photograph of the groundbreaking ceremony was still there, but the caption had changed. It now told the truth about Samuel Bell, about the original donation, about the nurses who protected his mission. And Grace's name was there. Not large. It didn't need to be. Elijah touched 2 fingers to the glass. Behind him, the revolving doors turned. Richard Halston entered carrying no entourage. His suit was simpler now. He had started volunteering one afternoon each week with the hospital's financial assistance program. He saw Elijah. Neither man spoke. Richard simply gave a small nod. Elijah returned it. Then Richard noticed the box. He walked over. Need a hand. Elijah looked at him for a moment. Months earlier, Richard had ordered guards to remove him from this same building. Now the question hung quietly between them. Not dramatic. Not grand. Just a hand offered where contempt had once been. Elijah shifted the box. Take that side. Richard did. Together, they carried it toward the children's elevators. Outside, spring rain began tapping softly against the glass. Months earlier, that sound had followed Elijah into the hospital as a man people wanted removed. Now nobody moved aside because he was powerful. Nobody bowed. Nobody applauded. And Elijah preferred it that way. At the elevator, a little girl rushed past and dropped a red crayon. Elijah bent down. So did Richard. Their hands reached it at the same time. Richard looked at him, then slowly pulled his hand back. Elijah picked up the crayon and handed it to the girl. Think you lost something? She smiled. Thank you. The elevator doors opened. The girl ran back to her mother. Elijah stepped inside with the box. Richard followed. Just before the doors closed, sunlight broke through the rain clouds and struck the steel plaque across the lobby. Grace Carter. For one brief moment, her name shone brighter than everything around it. Elijah saw it. His eyes softened. He could almost hear her voice. Not speaking about money. Not about Richard. Not even about justice. Just laughing in that little kitchen with the blue shutters, singing off-key while dinner burned on the stove. The memory no longer hurt in quite the same way. The elevator doors began to close. Across the lobby, Emily, the little girl Elijah had helped on that first rainy morning, was walking beside her mother. She noticed him. Mr. Elijah. He looked up. She waved. Elijah raised one hand. The doors closed. Inside the elevator, there was no music. Only the soft hum of cables pulling them upward. Richard held one side of the box. Elijah held the other. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. One man had once possessed almost everything and mistaken recognition for worth. The other had lost almost everything and discovered that worth was the one thing poverty had never taken from him. The elevator passed the second floor, then the third. On the fourth, they heard children's laughter somewhere beyond the doors. Elijah tightened his grip on the box. Richard did the same. The light above them changed. 5. The children's floor. The doors opened. Warm afternoon light spilled into the elevator. A nurse pushed an empty wheelchair past. Somewhere down the corridor, a child laughed again. Elijah stepped forward. Then Richard. Together. No cameras waited for them. No reporters shouted questions. No one applauded. And on the first floor below them, beneath the soft spring sunlight, Grace Carter's name remained quietly on the wall. Not because she had been rich. Not because she had been powerful. But because when nobody important was watching, she had chosen to protect people who could give her nothing in return. Elijah had done the same. And now, finally, the building did too. Outside, the rain stopped. A thin line of sunlight crossed the wet pavement. And somewhere beneath the old railway bridge on Fulton Street, the concrete place where Elijah once slept remained empty. The city moved around it. Cars passed. Water dripped from the steel beams. Nobody knew who had once slept there. Nobody needed to. Because Elijah Carter had never needed the world to know his name. He had only needed the world to remember something far more important. To look again before deciding what a human being is worth. And as the afternoon sun climbed across the windows of the Samuel Bell Children's Center, the doors below opened once more. This time for a mother carrying a sick child. No one asked whether she looked wealthy enough to enter. The nurse simply smiled and held the door.